Yeah, dating has been a lot more difficult nowadays than anything else. All these different dating abilities and apps, people talking about Snapchat is how they communicate with one another now, and explain how that even works, because I've been married just 3 years, but even I feel old when I hear people talking about it, because dating changes so drastically year to year, how it works, how it functions. In our time of my life growing up, if I liked a girl, I had to go talk to her, I had to, or message her on Facebook or through her phone. Nowadays, you like a girl, you just take a picture of yourself, send it to her, and you're like, hey, what's up? And that's how they start communication, with talking face to face, just with Snapchat. So it's so different from what I knew. And the way the world changes with dating all the time is we've got problems that will come about with that, naturally. So obviously Snapchat's got problems that we don't need to discuss at this time. We may discuss it in another episode, but obviously that happens to become a problem if you're not using it carefully. And anything can be used improperly. Anything is a tool, and it can be used improperly. And someone might say, well, the Bible can. Yeah, the Bible can if you put it in the hands of the right person. They can use it improperly, because many false doctrines have come about based on taking verses out of context and all that. So with dating, a question that I'd have is, what would you do if your child brings home a non-Christian as their boyfriend or girlfriend? How do you handle that?
Well, that's obviously, that's pretty, it's not as rare as you would think.
Right.
And especially in places where our young people, they're one or two young people in a congregation, and so you have, they're in a school system, maybe, or maybe they're just not even, maybe they're being homeschooled or something like that, but there's not that many other opportunities to be around, maybe, there's not a big youth group, and so they meet folks that are outside of the church. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. As far as meeting people outside the church, we need to be able to be evangelistic, and we need to be friendly to folks that we might be able to teach them the gospel and things like that. But therein lies the difficulty when they decide, okay, we want to date so-and-so, and they bring them home, and you find out, or you just find out that they've started talking and dating. And so I think that this conversation begins long before your children are of dating, quote, dating age, and that may be debatable to some as far as a dating age, but I think this conversation begins at a younger age, you training your children, them seeing, obviously, in your home the type of husband and wife, right. that their mom and daddy are, but also then to have some conversation as they mature and get a little bit older and get closer to that dating age. Then they're going to, they're obviously going to have questions, and I think rightly so. And you should be sparking some of that conversation as a parent with your young people. There again, we didn't really experience this, in our family near as much. My older son just got married, and to a wonderful young Christian lady, and she is super, and we love her as a daughter, and that's been a blessing. In fact, though, that's something that we prayed for early on for both of our boys, and I think that was key for us also, to keep that in our mind, to keep that before God as a prayer of ours, and I think God truly answered our prayers in that, and gave us, that opportunity, gave Chris that opportunity, and her as well, Caitlin as well. And so I think that was wonderful for them. But we tried to instill in them young, what type of girls they should be looking for. Dating is about who you might marry. Obviously, there are steps that are involved in that, right. And dating is a part of that. Some will talk about other means of doing that, courtship and things like that, and we could talk about that a little bit later. But when you think about that whole scene, I think that the question about it, what do you do if? I think it's about communication. It's about having that conversation. Like I say, if you start early, it's going to be easier. They're going to see certain things. They're going to be looking for things in their parents that they should be seeing, because that's who they're going to model after. And hopefully that's who they're going to see a good example in, and want to have, that kind of relationship as well. It doesn't always work out where, they meet a nice, Christian, young person, and that's who they want to date. There again, so, my suggestion is not to panic.
Yeah.
But to talk about it, to talk through it, to talk about the situations, to talk about the possible problems that might come down the road in that situation. You know, obviously, you know, we're talking about the dating situation. You know, I think that you have to put in several. You know, you teach them about boundaries. You teach them about you know, what's right and wrong when it comes to that. And so those things are in place, whether they're dating a Christian or a non-Christian, because let's face it, if they possibly could put themselves in a situation where they shouldn't be, whether it's a Christian or not, and because of being at a young age and things like that, that can be difficult. Mm-hmm. That they're putting themselves, you know, probably in dangerous positions in that way, and that can be problematic. But all of this is part of a conversation that's started way before they start dating. And so my thing is to remind them that, you know, we love them, we want to encourage them, but we want to keep open communication, because the last thing you want is for your child to shut down and not talk to you anymore. And so some conversations that I've heard in the past have been where they just completely, you're not absolutely, you know, this is not going to happen. You cannot, you know, and of course, if your child has a little bit of a rebellious streak, the first thing they're going to do is go and do all of that you just said, you know, against them, you know, and shame on them for it. But so you want to have an open communication with them. You want to know, they need to know that their parents are somebody that they can go and talk to about any and all of these things that they're facing, as awkward as it might seem because they're older and whatever. But if you have that communication with them early on, they're more likely to communicate that with you later.
Sure.
And listen to what you have to say.
I think the interesting thing is something you mentioned, that, you know, you date to marry.
Right.
And we have to understand what marriage truly is.
Yeah.
I didn't before I got married. And I don't even know if you can truly 100% know it until you're married.
True.
Because you don't know what that's like to share a life with someone and to have the burden and responsibility of taking care of that person. All you've done is dated or courted them. And, you know, in Genesis 2:24, it talks about man leaves father and mother, cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. Right. And the idea there, from what I understand of the Hebrew word of leaving father and mother, is you set it down and you walk away from it. And the interesting thing there is, it's not that you set your mom and dad down and you never talk to them again and you're never around them again, but it's you leave that part of your life behind. You are no longer the child that's under mom and dad's authority in their house. You are now growing up and becoming a man, getting married, starting your own home where you are the head of that home. Or you're marrying a man where you are now in submission to that man, you're, you know, respecting that man. And like we talked about previously, you got to have that respect in order to, you know, you got to show love to get that respect. But I think the important part here is you have to ask yourself two questions. Number one, can I be one flesh with this individual, being fully acceptable to God if they're not a Christian? Now, some people say no. I don't see that 100% though. And I understand that in a perfect world, this would happen. You'd check all the boxes. But some people would suggest that in order to be pleasing to God, you have to be married to a Christian. That removes a lot of situations and stories, though, where an individual married someone that wasn't and they were converted because of it. Or an individual dated someone who wasn't and they were converted because of it. But that's the first question you have to ask is, can I still be able to worship my Lord if I'm married to this person? If the answer is no, then I don't think it's wise. If the answer is no. Right. If they make it clear, I'm never going to ever do this, you have no hope, this is how I'm going to be, then it's probably wise to get out of that relationship. Sure. However, the second thing you have to ask is there an opportunity to teach? And if I'm expected, according to the Bible, you know, we've got more than just Matthew talking about going into all the world and teaching the gospel. If I'm expected to go into the world and teach the gospel, you mentioned creating relationships, meeting people outside of the home and maybe even outside of the church, and that's good. And the influences that we have, and we know of stories of people who meet a girl or meet a guy and they convert them. And maybe they don't even marry. Maybe they break up for a time. But that individual is a Christian now because of that relationship that they had for a short period of time with that other individual. So am I to suggest that it was evil that they got together when it brought about the result of that person having their soul saved? I can't see that. But it is like 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 4 talk about is you get married, you no longer have authority over your own body.
Sure.
In the sense of your wife's body is yours and you are hers. That's how that works. And if I'm going to get into a relationship where the husband or the wife is saying, you can't do this, I won't stand for that, and it's what my Lord is telling me to do, then I need to be able to try to see ahead into the future as much as I can when I'm dating somebody. And all of us can kind of sometimes admit, man, if I'd really looked at that, I would have seen it.
Right.
And if I really, we call it puppy love, where people get so blinded by love and affection that they don't see anything wrong with the other individual. But I don't see it wrong. I don't see it sinful to find someone that is not a Christian and date them. Maybe it's unwise to consider doing that, and I would agree that it needs to be careful because you're looking at an individual that you're going to spend the rest of your life with, but on Judgment Day, you're giving an account for your life.
Right.
And if your spouse is a hindrance to you getting to heaven, then much like the passage talks about cutting off your hand if it offends you or plucking out your eye if it offends you, cut off your spouse before they're your spouse.
Yeah.
And you hear the statement, the best time to get a divorce is before you get married.
Sure.
Because there's no heartache, there's no worry, and you haven't done anything that creates lasting consequences. But unwise, I would say that that's more what I lean toward. Because there's too many stories of individuals that have found the truth because of a relationship that they have with an individual. But I think the problem becomes this. Sometimes the boyfriend or the girlfriend of our children try to get them to do things that aren't right to do. And not always just downright sinful things like drugs and alcohol or, being physical with one another in the way that they're not allowed to be. But the thing I want to ask is, Wayne, what would you do if this individual is trying to get your child to go to their denomination and see how they see the Bible?
Yeah, and that's, with them dating a non-Christian, that's what it's going to typically lead to. It's going to say, okay, well, I came to services with you. Well, now you come to services with me. And so forth. And that's a question that has been in every teen Bible class that I've ever taught. That's the question that's come up. Well, so and so invited me. Well, should I go? Well, here's the problem that you're going to run into. Number one, we have to be not just committed to Christ, but convicted by Christ that this is what's right. This is the Lord's church. And that's lived out daily in our faith. Now, that's not to say that if I went to something, but if the situation tries to pressure me to leave my times of worship where I'm supposed to be at my local congregation, where I'm worshiping, God there in spirit and in truth, and I leave that, forsake that assembly, so to speak, and not go to that assembly to go to a denominational assembly. What is it that I have said? I've not just said that, hey, I like you enough and respect you enough that I'm going to go check out what you typically go to, but actually what it says is much, much more than that. It actually goes a lot deeper. It actually says, well, I'm okaying really what you, and I know somebody may get there and they may say, well, if I go, I want to ask you questions. I want to be able to talk about those things. But typically by our presence at some particular event, that lends credence to our acceptance of it. Mm-hmm. And so, that individual is trying as hard as you might be to convert you as you are them. And so to say that, hey, it's okay for us to be something else other than a member of the Lord's church. And so that's the problem that they're going to run into. So we have to think about, so somebody might say, okay, well, what if it's not at one of our particular times of service? Could I go to there again? There again, I would say with questions to follow. It would be a situation where, okay, we get to open the Bible and see if we can see those things in Scripture. And I get to ask some hard questions if you still want me to come. Right. And I've been asked to come to certain things like that and had opportunity to do that. But even that, as someone who's trained in the Bible and Scripture, and that's part of my everyday work, that is still a difficult proposition for me for all things to work out just right, so that I felt like I was able to properly ask the questions. And it sounds really good, but it rarely works out that way.
Right.
And so I would warn against that. I would say that absolutely do not miss services, any of the Lord's services, to go and do that. And even then, I would be careful about going to yet something else, because it still promotes the idea of acceptance of, even if you get to ask some questions. Hey, you gave in once. Maybe if I ask, they'll come again.
Right.
And they'll eventually just give in. And so that's the problem that I see with that. Well, what about you?
Yeah, and this is something that personally I have not had to experience as a father yet with a child that's under the age of dating, of course. But I did have these questions come up when I was a teenager. You know, you have not even girls or boys asking their spouse, not spouse, you know, the one they're dating,
Right.
but the people that are just friends. Because the task that we have is to go out and say to people, will you come to church with me? That's the task that we have. We're expected to go into the world and try to teach and preach Jesus to the lost. But the thing that we have forgotten is the denominational world's been told that same task. Yeah. They've been asked to do the same exact thing. And so you get into this situation where you look like you're saying, you can only come to my church. That's not what you're saying.
That's the perception.
Right. And it's not what you're saying. But I think that, like you mentioned with the questions about what's going to happen if a girl or boy comes home with someone that's not a Christian, the conversation starts at a young age. You instill to your children, like Deuteronomy 6, 7 through 9 talks about, you teach them diligently all parts of the day. If they're sitting, if they're standing, if they're laying, if they're walking, you're teaching your children as many times as possible. And we used to groan as children when we'd be in the car and my dad would go, well, there's a story in that, there's a lesson in that. And he would proceed to teach us something. And as children, we'd go, oh, no, not another story, not another lesson. Now being out of the house, I wish I could remember all of them. We forget in the moment, and then when we really need them, we're like, I should have paid more attention. But that's just it. That's what they're told to do. And then it talks about in verses 8 and 9, binding them as a sign on your hand, and there'll be frontlets between your eyes. It's almost as if you put on blinders, that you're seeing the Word of God everywhere you go, and that is all you're seeing is God's Word. I love verse 9. You write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, and sometimes churches have done this. You're entering in the auditorium, and it says, enter to worship. And then as you're leaving the auditorium, it says, leave to serve.
Right.
And what they mean by that is when you enter into this room, it is to worship the Heavenly Father. And when you leave this room, it is to serve Him. It is to go into the world and not forget what you've done here today.
Yeah. And who you are.
Yeah, and that's what that idea of writing it on the doorpost is anytime you walk in and anytime you go out, you're reminded of who you are and what you're supposed to be. If we do that with our children, if as my son grows older and as other sons and daughters that people have in this world, if as they're growing older, we're instilling in them this doctrine of the Lord and of all the things, they can go to an event like that on a Tuesday night, some prayer meeting they're having, and they'll know automatically what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
As long as they take what we've told them and have applied it. You have Proverbs 4, the writer there is the father saying to his child, I've given you good doctrine.
Right.
I've taught you in the way of the right path. I've led you the right way. Now it's up to you. You have to be the one to take what I've taught. And multiple times throughout Proverbs, you have the writer saying, please listen to me. Don't forsake the law of your mother. Listen to what we have to say. When a child grows up to be a teenager and his buddy or his girlfriend or her friend or her boyfriend say, hey, I'll come to my church. You come to my church, I'll come to yours. The very first thing they need to first do is understand if they're a Christian, they cannot forsake the assembly of God. They're expected to worship the Father. So Sunday's automatically out. They've got to worship the Lord. And really a Wednesday, by being subject to the eldership, is out. But a Tuesday night, if there's nothing going on at the congregation, sure, I would agree with you that they could go to a prayer meeting or a revival at a Baptist church or a Mormon church or any denominational church with questions following.
Yeah.
Because that's just it. Every time I've ever had someone come to church that's brought a visitor, there's always been questions.
Sure.
They always want to know, why do you do it this way? Yeah. We cheapen a Bible study opportunity when we go to a denominational service and we don't ask questions. Because we want to know the same thing a visitor wants to know about us. Where do we get the authority to do what we're doing? And so if you go to some, revival and they bring out the snakes and they're snake charming and they're speaking in tongues and all this kind of stuff, that's one of the very first questions you need to ask is, I noticed y'all brought out these snakes and it was kind of an odd scene, where do y'all get the authority to do that? what you're going to be able to do is have a Bible study without having a Bible study. Because that individual is going to just automatically try to tell you what they've been told for years.
Right.
Well, then you can say, okay, well, that's really neat, but where did you find that in the Bible? And if they can't pull out God's Word and give you what they found, then there's a problem.
Yeah.
Because when we don't have authority, we don't have the right to do. And that's what I think we've done. That's a problem, is we've forgotten Deuteronomy 6, 7 through 9 applies to New Testament teaching as well. That we teach our children every part of the day, that we put it as a frontlet between the eyes, that you put it on the doorpost so when you walk in and when you leave, you don't forget who you are. And my grandfather would always write in birthday cards to me, and he still does, ABC, always be Christian. And that's a common phrase that people have used. But my dad has also said to us before when we'd go out of town on trips and my mom and dad weren't coming, remember who you are. Right. And he was not saying, remember that you're B.J. Clark's son and Tish Clark's son. Right. Remember that you're God's son. Yeah. Remember that you're God's creation and that you should behave as such. When we remember that, going to an event like that will naturally come about with asking questions. But you see, that's not the only big problem that we face, Wayne. The problem that has become a very big craze today, especially with Snapchat and other apps like that, is getting into a physical relationship before marriage. And so, Wayne, what would you do if you found out that your child was being pressured to have a physical relationship with their boyfriend or girlfriend?
That's certainly a scary part for a parent, to get kind of knocked almost between the eyes with that kind of situation. You hope that you've trained them and prepared them, and that you've done all the teaching, that you've tried to remind them over and over. But in this sexually crazed world, that's where a lot of the, of course, social media can just kind of present itself in a way that makes those things, it leads to those things. When you talk about the physical relationship, obviously if they're snapping pictures and they're doing those kind of things, those are sinful things. The tools that are given to us by way of social media are not really meant for that. Unfortunately, that can be used for a lot of good at the same time. That being said, what they typically lead to are to those physical situations, and there's been a buildup because of that lust, that desire that's been fed by some of those other things, But if our young people are being pressured into that, we need to get them out of those situations. Again, kind of like a conversation that we had earlier, when we were talking about abuse. You want your children to be safe, and part of that's still wanting them to be safe. Keep them out of those situations. You say, okay, well then they go to school and they're around these people still. They're around these individuals, and so you can't take them out of every situation possible. You try to do the very best you can, and then I would say part of this is going to go back to what we've talked about in this whole lesson is starting early with the conversation. Our young people should have been taught somewhere along the way that someone who's pressuring them doesn't have their best interests in mind, doesn't truly love them, and that love might be an L-U-V, not an L-O-V-E type of love. And so we've taught them about that, and so we hope that that kind of thing would be instilled in them to the point that they realize, I never need to be alone in this situation or with this individual because of this situation, because of the pressure that's put on me here. And when it comes to dating, that can be pretty easily remedied. Harder for a parent to remedy it. You could say, okay, you're not going to ever date again, but there again, some of that's hard to regulate, because if they're around them at school and things like that, we don't want them to completely shut down, but we hope that we've instilled in them enough respect for their own bodies and their own selves and for God, and for what we've been teaching them this whole way, and what they've hopefully seen in their parents as they've grown up, is I need to be saving myself for that time when I can be one with my husband or wife, whatever the situation may be for them. So that's part of that. So We continue to teach them that sex outside of marriage is sinful. Hebrews 13 and verse 4, we teach them that their body's not their own. It belongs to God, remember? Even that, right. 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20. So we have to be careful about, our own body. We need to glorify God with our bodies, and giving into sexual temptations and lust of the flesh and lust of the eyes and those type of things. Those are not things where we would glorify God in our body, in our life, and the things that others are seeing from us. So, but again, we got to teach them not to get themselves into those situations, And again, some have taken the courting route. I'll bring that up. Some have taken that position. This is how, and if that's in your household, you decided, you're going to teach your children to court, and that's what they're going to. Those are the rules they're going to follow. I think that's good. For some, it's seen as a little. Maybe too strict in that, and maybe that's debatable or not. But ultimately, whether it's courtship or whether you teach your children about dating and not putting yourself into those situations, regardless, you help them set boundaries. And I think it is commendable for parents to do that. And I think it's commendable when we can see young people who have set for themselves their own goals.
Right.
I want to save myself for marriage, for the one that I marry. Because as you mentioned a moment ago, that relationship is a special relationship in the eyes of God. And it's a special relationship for a husband and wife. And if there's others that have been party to that prior to marriage, that makes it difficult. That's a difficult thing to overcome. And so I would say that the dating that's set with boundaries, courtship, whatever the case may be, however you want to do that in your home, consider that conversation has to start early. They have to be trained early on that, so that they know themselves well enough that they know that this is a situation I don't need to be in, and I need to remove myself from it. When it comes to dating, I've seen people before say, hey, well, let's start this, before we go out, let's have a word of prayer together. Right. Something that sets the tone of how this date is going to go, rather than going somewhere that it shouldn't be.
Right. And the thing to remember, too, is, I see these jokes going around Facebook and on other social media sites where it shows a girl with a cake. It says 20 on it, and it says, I made it out of my teenage years and I didn't get pregnant. And that's a sad joke that's going around, because that tells us the norm today is getting pregnant as a teenager is kind of a normal thing to us. But multiple verses in the T epistles talk about being pure. 1 Timothy 5:22, 2 Timothy 2:22, Titus 1:15. All of those convey this idea of keeping yourself pure. And if I'm told that the marriage bed is to be undefiled by God, then it's going to be a lot harder to do it when we've defiled ourselves in such a poor way. And I know undefiled also is conveying this idea of keeping it undefiled in the bedroom when you're married, but you've got to understand that was something that God intended for husband and wife to partake of. And in its own right, it's a wonderful blessing from God. When it's not done that way, it can be a very bad curse upon the lives of the people who are dealing with it. We've got to be careful and keep ourselves pure.